We would now like to introduce our keynote speaker, Mr. Clifton Truman Daniel.
Hello again. So now I am so excited to introduce our first keynote speaker, Mr. Clifton Truman Daniel. He's speaking from Chicago via Zoom. So now we are bringing down our screen so that we can project his face. His speech title is Beneath the Mushroom Cloud, the Truman and Sasaki Families. Clifton is the oldest grandson of President Harry S. Truman and his wife Beth. Clifton is honorary chairman of the board of the Truman Library Institute and board secretary of the Harry S. Truman Scholarship Foundation. He is the author of numerous books, including Growing Up with My Grandfather, Memories of Harry S. Truman. In addition to portraying his famous grandfather on stage, Mr. Daniel gives a series of lectures on various aspects of the Truman presidency and U.S. and White House history. Clifton visited Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 2012 and met Hibakusha and Masahiro Sasaki, Sadako Sasaki's brother, an album victim who died of leukemia at age 12. His speech highlights his meeting with the Sasaki family and his nuclear disarmament advocacy. The speech titled Beneath the Mushroom Cloud, the Truman and Sasaki Families. Thank you so much, Clifton, and now the microphone is yours.
Thank you, Misako. Good morning, everyone. My grandfather died when I was 15 years old. So we spent time with the family when I was young, mostly on vacations from school. He never spoke to me about the atomic bombings or much else about his presidency. And that is frankly because I was young and I was on a break from school and I didn't ask. I was happy to be out of school for a week or two. And you had to be careful with Grandpa because if he could get you to sit down for long enough, he would give you a lecture and would teach you something. So I learned about the atomic bombings like most everyone else. I learned about it in school. And my textbooks did not have much. You know, the textbooks, I don't know if they're still like that today, but in my day, you had to cover all of US history. So the atomic bombings got a page or a page and a half. And there was a picture of the ruins of Hiroshima, a picture of the mushroom cloud, but not much about what happened to the people on the ground. Years later, I was living, we'd moved to Chicago already, and my son Wesley was 10 years old. And he came home from school with the book, Sadako and the Thousand Paper Cranes. Masako has just alluded to that book. As she said, Sadako Sasaki was 2 years old when the bomb destroyed Hiroshima. And she and her family, most of them survived, but Sadako developed radiation-induced leukemia about 9 years later. And in her attempt to help the doctors, help herself, she folded 1,000 paper cranes, crane being a symbol of life and health. Sadly, that did not work. She died of the leukemia at age 12 in 1955. She died of the leukemia, and her friends and family built a memorial to her in the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Park. It's a statue of Sadako holding aloft a giant paper crane, and it's a memorial not just to her, but to all of the children who were killed or wounded or sickened by the bomb. That story, that book, was the first human story of Hiroshima or Nagasaki that I had ever seen, read, or heard. And Wesley's teacher, Rosemary Barilla, did not just give them the book and say, go home and read it. She taught them Japanese culture, Japanese history. They folded paper cranes in class. She actually took them to a Japanese restaurant. I came home one afternoon from work and I found Wesley in the living room wearing a kimono with green tea and sushi laid out on the coffee table behind him. And we all sat down and had a traditional Japanese dinner that night. So Rosemary and Wesley brought all of Japan, not just the bombings, but all of Japan into our home. And not long after that, I mentioned that on anniversaries of the bombing, usually about every 5 years, I would get calls from reporters, both in the US and in Japan, looking for a comment on the atomic bombings from the anniversary of the bombings. And I told a journalist not long after that I had read Sadako Sasaki's story. And of course, that story was read in Japan. And I had a call one afternoon from the journalist, acting as a translator between me and Masahiro Sasaki, Sadako's older brother. And we just talked back and forth for a few minutes. He was interested that I had read his sister's story. And he asked me if I would consider visiting Hiroshima and Nagasaki someday. And I said, yes. We did not get around to that for another 5 or 6 years. It was in 2010, in May of 2010, that Masahiro and his son Yuji came to the US to donate one of Sadako's last paper cranes to the World Trade Center Memorial, to what was then the 9/11 Tribute Center, before they had finished building the actual memorial. And they were donating one of Sadako's cranes as a gesture of peace and healing. And at the end of our meeting, Yuji Sasaki, he probably still does, carries a little plastic box filled with tiny paper cranes. Sadako had used, in the hospital, she had used anything she could get her hands on to make cranes from. This included gum wrappers, medicine labels, any kind of paper she could get a hold of. And she frequently didn't have much, so some of those cranes are very tiny. And Yuji had this little plastic box full of them, and he took one out and he dropped it into my palm. And he said, that's the last one that Sadako folded before she died. And at that point, he and his father both asked again if I would consider visiting Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And again, I said yes. We went 2 years later, in August of 2012. I went, my wife Polly went, and our sons Wesley and his younger brother Gates all went to Japan for 10 days and attended both ceremonies in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. During that time, we spoke to, and Masahiro had arranged all of this, we spoke to more than 24 survivors just to hear their stories, just so they could tell us what had happened to them on August 6th or August 9th. They came to us with no other wish than to do that and to just tell us their stories. Not everybody was happy about the visit, but none of the survivors who came to us in anger. They just wanted to tell the stories. And each one of them asked at the end of their testimony if we would please continue to help them tell those stories so that this never happens again, so that human beings, countries, people do not use nuclear weapons on each other ever again. All the meetings, I can't imagine how hard it is for them to live through it over and over and over and over again, but they do it in the name of peace and in the name of disarmament. As I said, none of them came to us in anger. We had one hitch at the beginning of the visit in Tokyo before we took the train to Hiroshima. A young reporter from NHK, which is the state-run media in Japan, a young reporter named Nana Yamada from NHK did an interview in Tokyo, and I think the second or third question she asked me was, "Are you here to apologize?" And I said, no, that's not what the visit is about. The visit is about honoring the dead and listening to the living and making sure that this does not happen again, to do what we can to make sure it doesn't happen again. She rephrased the question several times to the point where my friend and interpreter, Kazuko Minamoto, from the Japan Society in New York was half out of her chair, getting ready to jump in. She was very angry at this apparent breach of civility. But we got past it. And the question only came up twice more during the whole 10 days we were there. It came up during a rooftop interview in Hiroshima that I was doing with Masahiro Sasaki. And Masahiro, when the question was asked of me, Masahiro jumped in, interrupted, and got in front of the camera and said, "Look, if we ask him for an apology for Hiroshima and Nagasaki, he can ask us one for Pearl Harbor. And where do we go from there? We'll just keep going around in circles, wondering who should apologize last. This is not the point." And we went on from there. Masahiro was, as you can all imagine, I guess I was nervous being in Japan, given the family background. Masahiro made sure that he stayed with me the whole time. We often went arm in arm to the different sites in the peace parks. He was just a good steward, a good friend. And again, all of those survivors that came to me came in peace, came just asking for help. After that trip, I went on, I think it was the following year, in 2013, I took Wesley, my son, the one who brought us Sadako's story. Wesley and I went back to Japan on a grant and interviewed more than a dozen survivors, folks that we had met the year before, and recorded their testimony. Those testimonies are now available through the Harry S. Truman Library in Independence, Missouri, for anybody who wants to use them, anybody doing a documentary or a news story or writing a book has, I think at this point, 20 different recorded testimonies from survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And I'm not sure the year it was just a couple of years after that Masahiro and Yuji and I went on a 3-city peace tour, if you will. We spoke to a social studies teacher in New Orleans, social studies teachers at a big conference in New Orleans, Louisiana. We went to New York to do a program at the Japan Society. And we wound up back in Independence, Missouri at my grandfather's presidential library, where Masahiro and Yuji donated one of Sadako's last surviving cranes to the Truman Library so that we could put it on exhibit. It stayed in a glass case in the front lobby for several years until a recent massive restoration of the Truman Library. And it is now the final word in the exhibit on the atomic bombings. The exhibit starts with in the middle of the room is a glass case with the arming plug for the bomb that destroyed Nagasaki. And on the wall behind it is Sadako's crane, surrounded by 500 cranes folded by local school children in Missouri, as well as a big plaque outlining Sadako's story and talking about the damage done to the cities and the horrible damage done to human beings by those weapons. There's also nearby a television touchscreen that you can call up and listen to survivor testimony, some of the ones that Wesley and I collected in Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 2013. Also other US survivors, soldiers, civilians, presenting a broad range of views on the bombings and their aftermaths. Having been to Hiroshima and Nagasaki with Masahiro and Yuji, I went on for 4 years after that, working with an organization in New York City called Hibakusha Stories. And for 8 years, I joined the last 4 years of the project, but for 8 years, Hibakusha Stories brought survivors to New York City to speak to high school students about the atomic bombings, to tell their stories. And when I was working with them, I went every spring and fall for 4 years and talked to, during the program, we spent a week or two in New York going to as many high schools as we could get lined up. And the format was always the same. It would start with one of the two founders of the organization, Kathleen Sullivan and Robert Kronquist. And by the way, just before I came on the air here this morning, Kathleen called me out of the blue just to ask if we were going to be in town because she was coming through Chicago, and I told her I was speaking to a disarmament conference. So she thought that was good timing. But Kathleen or Robert would start by talking about the massive proliferation of nuclear weapons in this country, the thousands and thousands of bombs, many of them 100 or 1,000 times more powerful than the bombs that destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. How many of them are still aimed at Cold War targets? How many are still on hair trigger alert? And the dangers of that. And then I would get up and give essentially this speech that I'm giving to you now. And then we would introduce the survivor who would tell his or her story. The students reacted very well to that. They were riveted by the survivor stories. Not mine so much, but certainly by the survivors' stories. And again, that's a hard thing for someone who's lived through that to do over and over and over again. But the aftermath seemed very positive. The students wanted to stay around, wanted to talk to Shigeko Sasamori or Setsuko Nakamura, Thurlow, or Yasuaki. All of these folks stuck around afterwards and talked to the survivors. I think during the 8 years that Hibakusha Stories was active, and it's sort of slumbering now, but it's still active. But I think in the 8 years that it was active, they spoke to 30 or 35,000 high school students in and around the New York area. I have since gone on to write about this. I've given this lecture lots of times in the years since. But I think, again, you all have been talking about this morning, and I think it's perfectly true that you guys are the future for this. You're going to inherit the mess we've made, but this ridding the world of nuclear weapons is going to be up to you, and it's no easy task because they're entrenched, and governments don't think they can do without them as a threat and a deterrent. So you have a lot of work cut out for you, but it's worth it. And I have never been with a better group of people than the folks that I worked with in the disarmament arena for those 5 or 6 years that I was actively doing that. The survivors themselves are remarkable people for what they've lived through and what they give continually. Some of my friends in that arena, Shigeko Sasamori is gone now. She died just recently. Shigeko was in her early to mid 90s, and a sweetheart. She was one of the Hiroshima maidens. If you all know that story, she was brought to this country 10 years after the bombing for reconstructive surgery. She was badly burned by the bomb in Hiroshima. She was looking up when the bomb went off, so it essentially exploded in her face. But Shigeko has spent much of her life talking to people, talking to students. Setsuko Thurlow lived in Canada, in Toronto. She was a social worker. She earned the Order of Canada for her work with social work and for talking about the effects of nuclear weapons. Setsuko is still with us. She's a tireless campaigner against nuclear weapons. Yasuaki Yamashita lives in Mexico, comes to the US to speak about his experiences in Nagasaki. The recent Nobel Prize winners, Nihon Hidankyo, Reiko Yamada was one of the survivors who is, I think she still is a member of Nihon Hidankyo. So a remarkable group of people to keep telling their stories and keep working on this, to keep the rest of us from going through what they went through. And as odd as it sounds, my being the grandson of the man who ordered those bombings, first of all, I think he would approve of anything we can do to end the world nuclear weapons, no matter how it started. But also, I've been lucky enough to have these friends people who have survived Hiroshima and Nagasaki. 2 weeks before we went to Japan the first time in 2012, I answered my phone driving back from dropping my youngest off at school. I picked up some messages, and there was someone with a lovely voice singing me happy birthday, because it was in fact my birthday. Well, it turned out to be Shigeko singing me, I'm getting a happy birthday serenade from a survivor of Hiroshima. And of course, the upshot of that is I had to learn how to sing happy birthday in Japanese so that I could sing it back to her 2 weeks later, because our birthdays are only 2 weeks apart. But a remarkable group of people. And I think it was said earlier that survivors, that we're not going to have any of them around much longer. Shigeko's gone. Setsuko is in her mid-90s. Yasuaki must be in his late 80s or early 90s by now. He was only 6 when the bomb destroyed Nagasaki. But they are not going to be with us much longer. Their children, second-generation survivors, take this very seriously. I know some of them as well, and they are committed to telling those stories. But a lot of this is going to be up to you on a personal level, a storytelling level, and a political level, eventually, for some of you. So in closing, I'll just say, I'm glad you're doing this. I'm glad you're there. I'm glad you're committed to this. And I wish you all the best of luck in the future, keeping this entire planet safe from the scourge of nuclear weapons. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Clifton. So inspiring. Thank you so much. Really appreciate.